What if the next world war isn't fought over land, resources, or political ideologies, but over the very gods we pray to and the ancient cultures we belong to? In the early 1990s, as the long and bitter Cold War finally came to an end, the world erupted in a collective cheer. Many prominent scholars and political analysts declared the end of history, confidently asserting that Western liberal democracy and free market capitalism had won the ultimate victory. The prevailing sentiment was an intoxicating optimism. Humanity would no longer be torn apart by grand ideological battles, and nations across the globe would steadily march toward a unified, westernized, and peaceful future. However, Harvard University's eminent political scientist, Samuel P. Huntington, saw a completely different horizon. Through his monumental work, The Clash of Civilizations, he delivered a chilling and prophetic warning to a world drunk on the illusion of eternal peace. Huntington argued that while the era of ideological conflict between capitalism and communism had indeed ended, it was merely making way for a much older, deeper, and more primal form of human division. For centuries, wars were waged by kings seeking territory or by superpowers imposing their economic systems. But in the emerging world order, Huntington predicted that the fundamental source of global conflict would not be political or economic, but cultural. The most dangerous and volatile battle lines of the future would be the cultural and religious fault lines separating the world's major civilizations. In this groundbreaking analysis, Huntington maps the globe into 8 distinct civilizational blocks: Western, Confucian, Cynic, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and African. He deliberately highlights profound distinctions even among geographical neighbors, such as separating the deeply isolated Japanese civilization from the broader Confucian culture of East Asia. This intricate patchwork of global identities, he argued, shapes how people view the relationship between God and humanity, the citizen and the state, and the delicate balance between liberty and authority. Perhaps the most controversial and fiercely debated element of Huntington's thesis is his analysis of fault line conflicts. He pointedly observed that the borders separating Islamic civilization from its non-Islamic neighbors were uniquely volatile, famously declaring that Islam has bloody borders. He argued that the resurgence of religious fundamentalism, combined with demographic explosions in the Middle East and parts of Asia, would inevitably lead to violent friction, particularly against the secular West and the Slavic Orthodox world. The tragic events of September 11th, 2001, and the subsequent decades of turmoil in the Middle East seemed to validate his grim forecast with haunting accuracy. Crucially, Huntington turns a critical mirror toward the West. He dismantles the arrogant Western assumption that its values, such as individualism, democracy, and human rights, are universally applicable and desired by all of humanity. To the rest of the world, he notes, Western universalism is often perceived as nothing more than disguised imperialism. As non-Western nations grow in economic and military power, they no longer feel compelled to mimic the West. Instead, they are turning inward, finding renewed strength and political mobilization in their indigenous religious and cultural roots. Ultimately, the clash of civilizations is not merely a prediction of doom, it is a desperate plea for geopolitical pragmatism. Huntington warns that the surest path to a global catastrophe, a third world war, is for the West to persistently intervene in the affairs of other civilizations in the name of universalism. To survive this new era, humanity must abandon the utopian dream of a single, homogenized global culture. World leaders must learn to accept and respect a multipolar, multi-civilizational order where differences are acknowledged and boundaries are respected. Let us now delve deeper into the hidden layers of this geopolitical masterpiece and explore the profound questions it leaves for our future.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down one of the most influential and, controversial theories in modern politics, Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. So picture this. It's the early 1990s. The Berlin Wall is rubble. The Soviet Union has evaporated. The old map of the world, us versus them, East versus West, it's suddenly useless. So everyone, and I mean everyone, was scrambling for a new way to make sense of it all, asking this one huge question. What are we going to fight about now? And out of that uncertainty, two giant ideas came to the forefront. On one hand, you had Francis Fukuyama's End of History. He painted this really optimistic picture of a future where Western liberal democracy had basically won. But then there was Samuel Huntington, and he had a much darker prediction that the real fault lines, the new sources of conflict, were going to be all about culture. Okay, so let's really get into what Huntington was arguing. He said, look, the Cold War is over, but don't expect world peace. Instead, the big fights of the future aren't going to be about ideology anymore, capitalism versus communism. No, they were going to be about something much older, much deeper, a clash between the world's major civilizations. So, what on earth did he mean by a civilization? Well, for Huntington, this wasn't about lines on a map or who had what kind of government. A civilization is the biggest possible us. It's that broadest level of cultural identity, defined by shared history, language, traditions, and, this is the big one, religion. And this is so interesting because this slide basically redraws the entire world map. It's not about countries anymore. It's about these huge cultural blocks. Huntington laid out these 8 major civilizations you see here. And his core argument was that each one has these fundamentally different, deeply held beliefs about everything. God, the individual, the state, you name it. So why did he think this clash was pretty much unavoidable? Well, he laid out 6 key reasons. For example, take a look at points 2 and 4. He said that as the world shrinks and we all interact more, we don't feel closer. We actually become more aware of how different we are. And at the same time, the peak of Western power was making other civilizations double down on their own identities, a return to the roots. But maybe his most crucial point was number 5. Culture is sticky. You can change your politics, you can change your passport, but you can't easily change, as he put it, what you are. Well, you can probably guess what happened next. As soon as Huntington published this theory, wham! It was met with an absolute storm of criticism from other thinkers who said it was simplistic, that it was dangerous, and that it was just plain wrong. I mean, just look at this quote on the slide. It's pretty chilling, right? This isn't a prediction of a few border skirmishes. He was forecasting that the next massive global war would be fought between these huge cultural teams. But critics like the legendary scholar Edward Said, they fired right back. Said's response was brilliant. He basically said, this isn't a clash of civilizations, it's a clash of ignorance. He argued that Huntington wasn't describing reality. He was just creating these giant, clumsy stereotypes like the West and Islam, and completely ignoring all the incredible diversity and arguments happening within those so-called civilizations. And this slide just nails the critics' central point. They'd say, just look at the world. The bloodiest conflicts aren't happening between civilizations, they're happening inside them. And even more telling, look at who allies with whom. The real world is messy. You have Islamic Iran backing Orthodox Armenia against Islamic Azerbaijan. You have many Muslim nations staying quiet about China's treatment of its Uyghur Muslim population. Clearly, critics argue, geopolitics and national interests often trump culture. So it all boils down to this really fundamental disagreement. What is the nature of conflict itself? For Huntington, it's like a prisoner's dilemma, where it's always the smart, rational move to assume the other side is out to get you. But for his critics, it's more of a perceptual dilemma, a tragic mistake where both sides might actually want peace, but are trapped by fear and a complete misreading of each other. And that brings us to maybe the most powerful criticism of all, that the clash of civilizations is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Think about it. If you keep telling world leaders that conflict with the other is inevitable, that the world is just a bunch of hostile teams, well, you might just be encouraging the very hostility you're claiming to predict. Okay, so we've got the theory and we've got the pushback. Now let's do what we do here and actually test this thing against the real world. How does Huntington's framework help us, or maybe hinder us, in understanding the conflicts we see in the headlines today? First up, the war in Ukraine, which is without a doubt one of the most defining conflicts of our time. You know, it's pretty wild, but decades ago, Huntington specifically pointed to Ukraine as what he called a cleft country. He saw it as a nation literally split down the middle by a civilizational fault line, with a Catholic West-leaning population on one side and an Orthodox Russia-leaning population on the other. From his point of view, the war we're seeing today is the ultimate, tragic eruption along that deep cultural crack. Okay, let's head over to the Caucasus now, and that decades-long conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. If you wanted a textbook example of what Huntington called a fault line war, well, this is pretty much it. You've got Orthodox Christian Armenia on one side and Islamic Azerbaijan on the other. And you can see his kin country syndrome in full effect as other nations get drawn in to support their cultural family, like Turkey backing Azerbaijan and Russia playing its own complex role with Armenia. And, of course, we have to look at the searing conflict between Israel and Hamas and the shockwaves it sends around the world. Now, this is an incredibly complex conflict with deep local roots. But you can't deny that on the global stage, it is very often framed as a civilizational one. It gets portrayed as a battle pitting the Western-backed, Judeo-Christian world against the forces of Islamic resistance. And that framing deepens divisions and rallies support along exactly the kinds of civilizational lines Huntington described. All right, so after laying out the theory, the critiques, and how it seems to map or not map onto today's world, where does that leave us? What's the big takeaway from all this? It feels like we're left with two totally different ways to look at this whole idea. Is it an accurate prophecy, a tough, realist description of how the world actually works, where culture is the ultimate driver of conflict? Or is it a dangerous warning, a flawed, overly simple way of looking at things that actually creates conflict by forcing us all into these neat, hostile boxes? What's really important to remember is Huntington's own conclusion. It wasn't some call for the West to go out and conquer everybody. In fact, it was the exact opposite. His advice was for the West to drop the idea that its values are universal for everyone. He basically said, stop trying to remake other civilizations to be like you. Instead, figure out what makes your own civilization unique, and then learn to coexist with all the others. And that leaves all of us with a final, massive question to chew on. These deep cultural and religious identities that make us who we are they destined to be boundaries, walls that will always divide us and lead to conflict? Or can we, by trying to understand those very differences, somehow turn them into bridges? Honestly, the answer to that question is probably going to shape our entire century.